Margaret Tudor took the Scottish Earl of Angus as her second husband, only for the union to turn into a living nightmare. She gave up much of her power and eventually had to flee back to England with the help of her brother Henry VIII. But when she returned after a year to be with her husband, she made a disturbing discovery. Margaret was the very first Tudor Princess of England. Born in 1489, she was the second child, but oldest girl of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. In a time when royal baby boys were normally much more appealing than girls, Margaret's parents were actually happy with their daughter, but not for a particularly good reason. Margaret's dad Henry didn't have a steady hold on power. He'd claimed his throne by slaying the previous king, which meant that Henry couldn't really play the "I'm the king because God said so" card. His best bet for keeping his crown was playing nice with other European powers, and that meant having daughters to marry off to eligible bachelors. Princess Margaret grew up in the luxurious Eltham Palace with her younger siblings, the infamous Henry VIII and her sister Mary, who would become the Queen of France. Royals loved marrying off literal children, and Margaret's family was no different. Before she was even 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to King James IV of Scotland, who was 22. Young Margaret's hand in marriage would seal England and Scotland's Treaty of Perpetual Peace. For years, Margaret's family and King James had been fighting each other, and now council members feared that marrying young Margaret to James IV could pave the way for the Scots to grab the English throne. When she was 12, Margaret and James were married via proxy ceremony, which means he wasn't actually at the wedding, a bit like when people can't be bothered turning up to receive their Oscar. And although Margaret stayed in England for 2 more years, she was legally referred to as Queen of Scots. In 1503, when Margaret was only 14, her mother, Queen Elizabeth of York, gave birth to a child who only lived for a couple of days. Then, about a week later, Queen Elizabeth died too. In June, mere months after losing her mother, Margaret followed her dad's orders and headed off to Edinburgh, and on August the 8th, 1503, Margaret capped off her rollercoaster of a year with a royal wedding. She and James tied the knot at beautiful Holyrood Abbey. James IV was way too old for Margaret Tudor. However, if you had to marry a royal stranger, James would be at the top of the list. He was charismatic, rich, and funny. James jumped directly onto his horse rather than use the stirrups. Then, to the joy of the Scottish people, he invited Margaret to squish onto his horse so that they could ride to Edinburgh together. Cute. During her marriage to King James, Margaret gave birth 6 painful times. Sadly, all the children except for one would die as infants. The only surviving child was a boy named James. On April 21st, 1509, Margaret's father, King Henry VII, died at the age of 52 from tuberculosis. With Henry's demise, Margaret's life and the course of British history changed overnight. Margaret's younger brother, Henry VIII, ascended to the throne of England, and with his reign, the peace treaty between England and Scotland immediately began to break down. England began fighting with France, which was Scotland's long-time ally. It didn't take long for tensions to reach fever pitch. Soon enough, Margaret's husband and brother were on opposite sides of a vicious conflict. As Henry got ready to invade France, James got ready to invade England. Margaret, meanwhile, was dealing with her own problems. Henry was so mad that she sided with her husband that he threatened to disinherit his own sister from the throne. As James got ready to fight for Scotland, Margaret began to suffer from terrifying nightmares. According to legend, she dreamt of James falling from a great height. On September 9th, 1513, Margaret Tudor sat in Linlithgow Palace and waited to hear about her husband's fate in the enormous chaotic Battle of Flodden. Soon enough, Margaret's premonitions were confirmed in the worst way possible. Along with 10,000 Scots, her beloved James charged into the fray only to be violently slain by the English forces. Margaret's sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, had James's bloody coat retrieved from Flodden and sent it to her husband Henry VIII as a love token. With her husband gone and the heir to the throne still in nappies, Margaret Tudor became the regent ruler of Scotland. She held power on behalf of little Prince James until he came of age. All this was clearly laid out in the deceased king's will. Unfortunately, the court deeply resisted Margaret's power. For one, people hesitated to let a woman rule, but Margaret was also awkwardly the sister of the guy who had indirectly killed King James in the first place. During this eventful and horrible time in Margaret's life, she was also dealing with the discomfort and stress of being pregnant. In the spring after her husband's passing, Margaret went into labour and gave birth to the Scottish king's last son, Alexander. In between all the power grabs and personal tragedies, Margaret somehow found time to fall in love. Archibald Douglas was, according to his own family, a young, witless fool, and apparently Margaret couldn't get enough of him. In August 1514, she eloped with this fool, and soon enough, all hell broke loose. You see, the terms of King James's will stated that Margaret could reign until her son came of age, with the proviso that she remain a widow. So, she literally gave up her crown to marry this guy. While King James had spoiled Margaret with gifts and love, her new man was a different story. It turned out that Archibald Douglas had been two-timing Margaret from the very beginning. When he married her, he was already engaged to another woman. In fact, by some accounts, he might have already been married. Queen Margaret did not have a peaceful exit from the throne. After marrying Douglas, the Scottish court turned on her and demanded that she give up her crown and let the Duke of Albany govern the country. This was already an insult, but for Margaret, the real kicker was that the court insisted she leave her sons James and Alexander with them. Feeling like she was backed into a corner, Margaret handed over her children to the new governor of Scotland. Soon after, she decided to leave Scotland entirely. To get away from the country's watchful eyes, Margaret appealed to an unlikely saviour, her brother, Henry. Henry helped Margaret flee from Scotland and escape the wrath of the new ruler, the Duke of Albany. However, he didn't necessarily do it out of the kindness of his heart. Henry had to keep Margaret happy because at this time, she was his heir. To add to Margaret's stress, she was carrying her second husband's child as she fled Scotland. Of course, he didn't stick around to support her through the birth. Instead, he stayed in Scotland to make nice with the new ruler. After giving birth to her baby daughter, Margaret was so sick that she couldn't bear to be moved, and the bad news just kept coming. Margaret learned that her baby son Alexander hadn't made it to his second birthday. The loss of Alexander broke Margaret's heart and led her to lash out with a scandalous accusation. She publicly accused the Duke of Albany of poisoning her baby son. Margaret spent much of 1516 travelling, only for her days in the sun to grind to a halt. After all, Henry always had his eye on the prize. To gain power in Scotland, he needed Margaret there influencing her son, the future king, to play nice with England. By 1517, she was back in Scotland and about to have her life turned upside down. Her second husband, Douglas, had shacked up with an old mistress, and the pair were living a lavish lifestyle. A lifestyle he was charging to Margaret's purse. Upon discovering her second husband's adultery, Margaret immediately got to work on divorcing him. But this was back in the 1500s, so that was going to take a long time. By 1521, Margaret and Douglas were in a scorched earth breakup. While Margaret was doing everything she could to divorce him, Douglas was busy controlling her money, barring her from her lands, and keeping her from acting in her son's court. And to make matters worse, in the last few years, Douglas and his allies had seized control of the Scottish government, meaning that he was not an easy guy to dump. Luckily for Margaret, she had a clever trick up her sleeve. When Douglas and his men took over the government, they booted out the Duke of Albany. Back in the day, Albany and Margaret were enemies, but now the two joined forces. In November of 1521, Margaret successfully waged a coup against her own husband. He was humiliatingly booted from power and relieved of all his government titles. Douglas could only watch as his wife marched victoriously into Edinburgh, side by side with their once mutual enemy, the Duke of Albany. To some people, Margaret reconciled a little too well with her ex-rival. Rumours swirled that the Queen of Scots was having an affair with her new ally. But she was dealing with far more than just an unpopular romance. She soon learned that she'd let an honest-to-God spy into her household too. The lady in question was Margaret's friend, the nun Isabella Hop-Pringle. Whenever tensions between England and Scotland flared up, she'd use her closeness with the Queen to sell Scottish secrets to Henry VIII. When it looked like angry Scottish nobles were going to make both Isabella and her convent pay the price, Queen Margaret actually stepped in to get mercy for her. In return, Margaret told Hop-Pringle that she had to stop spying and be loyal only to Margaret. She returned the favour by continuing to spy for the English. As Isabella's spying might have suggested, England and Scotland were back to hating each other. For years they'd get into fights, nearly start a war, then retreat once freaked out courtiers sent enough diplomatic letters. Everyone double-crossed everyone else until the dust settled and Margaret's son, King James V, finally took the throne in 1524. But even with her son wearing the crown, Margaret still had her own battles to fight. First one on the chopping block, her awful estranged husband, Archibald Douglas. Even though Henry VIII wanted Margaret and Douglas to reunite, she was still desperate for a divorce. Over the last few years, she'd ousted Douglas from power, got him exiled to 2 different countries, and even threatened to start a war before letting him back into Scotland. It was fairly obvious that she was over him. But Henry VIII didn't exactly take no for an answer. He invited Douglas to come on over and woo his sister back. After point-blank refusing to reconcile with Douglas, Margaret's power-hungry estranged husband lashed out. He and his men marched on the Scottish Parliament and attempted to seize control from Margaret and her son, King James. Margaret wrote to her old ally, the Duke of Albany, and explicitly said that she'd team up with him and fight England before she'd take Douglas back. Unfortunately, this letter was intercepted by the worst possible person, her brother, Henry VIII. He gave her such a dressing down that she fearfully took back her words and began to play nice with Douglas. When Douglas got even an inch of power, he did his best to use it for all it was worth. For example, when he was given guardianship over the 14-year-old King James in 1526, he used the opportunity to try to turn the boy against Margaret and her brother, King Henry. Douglas all but kidnapped the boy, refusing to let him go back to his mother. Margaret desperately tried to rescue her son, but none of her attempts were successful. In the end, the boy king had to escape all by himself after 3 long years in his deranged stepfather's house. When he finally reunited with Margaret, James was stunned. A lot had happened to his mother in the years that he'd been away. For one, Margaret had a new lover in the Scottish nobleman Henry Stuart. Beginning in 1524, the Queen lavished her beau with fancy appointments and titles, all of which ticked off the senior nobility. Soon enough, Margaret began to share a home with her new boyfriend, now fancily titled Lord Methven. Margaret, who used to be a constant member of the Scottish court, barely attended Parliament anymore, and people whispered that it was because she was concealing an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. At this point, Margaret needed a divorce like never before. She felt she had no choice but to use her trump card. For once, Douglas's endless womanising actually worked in Margaret's favour. She got her much wished for divorce thanks to the fact that when she and Douglas tied the knot, he was already engaged to another woman. With that, Queen Margaret Tudor was finally free. So what did she do? Obviously, she immediately married another awful man. Just 1 year after her divorce, Margaret married Lord Methven. Unfortunately, he turned out to be even more adulterous and wasteful than her second husband. He shacked up with a mistress of his own, and just like Douglas, he and his lover lived on Margaret's dime. This is a huge part of why, 10 years after their wedding bells rung, Margaret was petitioning for another divorce. After June 1528, James V began to rule for himself, but Margaret held no role in her son's government. In fact, mother and son didn't seem to get along when forced to interact directly. James had ticked off Margaret by refusing to let her divorce another husband. Margaret also complained about lack of money given to her by the king. In actuality, their relationship fell apart firmly because of one person: Margaret. She had been caught spilling her son's state secrets to his rival King Henry VIII in 1543. Margaret spent the rest of her life petitioning for Henry VIII to return her younger child, Lady Margaret Douglas. The young woman was raised in the English court, where she followed her mother in scandal. Margaret Jr. also had an affair with a courtier and landed herself in the Tower of London. When she was released, she remained at her uncle's court and never saw her mother again. All in all, Margaret wasn't the best mother, the greatest judge of character, or the most savvy ruler. Over her later years, she annoyed enough people, including her powerful brother and son, that her influence dwindled away. Even though she and James made up later in life, they didn't have many happy years together. Shortly after a stroke, Margaret Tudor died on October 18th, 1541, at the age of 51. Even though Margaret had sent for her son James, he didn't get to his mother's bedside quickly enough. Sadly, she breathed her last breath without him by her side. Margaret Tudor has a significant legacy. After all, she may have been the one who introduced King Henry VIII to the idea of divorce. When Henry heard that his big sister would dare to treat the sacrament of marriage so lightly, he was absolutely aghast. He also once said it was impossible for anyone to live a more shameful life than Margaret. After a lifetime of fighting and making up, Queen Margaret Tudor of Scotland kind of got the last laugh over her infamous brother. Her descendants are the ones who sit on the throne today, not Henry's. Henry VIII died without grandchildren, but Margaret was grandmother to Mary, Queen of Scots, and thus great-grandmother to James I, who succeeded Elizabeth I on the English throne. Therefore, today's British royal family owes their claim via dignified descent from the scandalous Margaret Tudor. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.